Shut up, compressor. Hey everyone, Matt here from Doogs Models, and welcome to what may well be the final installment in the Black Basing 201 video series, at least for now. Now, this particular installment is building on learnings that we've accumulated over the course of all the previous demos, and one of the big ones is the idea of moving from dark to light. So, as demonstrated on the SEA camo and over here on the green and gray, with putting various complementary tones, darker but complementary tones, underneath the overall blend coat, we managed to kind of curve the shot a little bit in terms of where we end up with the final color. On this one, as we've already gone through, the field green is substantially brighter but still in the same ballpark as the field green with the Warsaw Pact olive green underneath it. That has worked out pretty well so far. And in the cases where we've broken from that and where we've baked in colors that are lighter and darker than the blend coat, it's caused problems. Now, I've been struggling to figure out the best way to really articulate what's going on with that whole light-dark contrast gap issue. I mean, I've got this little card that I keep showing over and over again, and essentially what it comes down to is when you add, if you have a color that is sort of in this middle range, when you start trying to come at it from both the dark side and the light side, you're essentially working both ends against the middle, and you lose a lot of this gap potential. And so, for a silly metaphor, think about it like parking a car. Now, if the challenge is to pull a car into a parking space and get it so the bumper is really close but not quite touching the car in the space opposite, that's pretty easy if you're just parking your car. You pull in, you pull up, you know where the corners of your vehicle are, maybe you even have some collision sensors on the front bumper, and it lets you walk it into where it needs to be. That's black basing. You're coming at it from the dark side, literally, and just sneaking up on that full color value until you're right up against it. Now imagine doing that and having to get right up against that bumper while the other car is also pulling in, and it suddenly becomes much more complicated because you have to manage both of those, and that margin of error is substantially less. You ultimately end up, where's my Hilo Drab? You ultimately end up having to play both ends against the middle, and that ends up using more paint, and the more paint you use, the more you're covering up a lot of that micro variation you've been baking in, so you end up with something that just doesn't quite work for what you were intending. Now, there is a comment on YouTube saying that this Hilo Drab actually looks perfect for weathered World War II olive drab on armor vehicles, which I would actually agree with. For the most part, I still think, it has some of the cover the gray issues going on, but ultimately, even if it does look good as olive drab, it's supposed to be Hilo Drab, and it's, I think the fuselage here captures it much better, but it kind of rams home that lesson of both ends against the middle. Now, playing with complementary darker shades has produced all kinds of interesting results. I mean, we've got some on the SEA camo in here between these two different green base coats. We've got a lot of it on the green and the gray. One thing we haven't really played with outside of the gloss sea blue is putting darker, really different tones underneath the paint. And so that's what I want to play with in this final installment. What happens if we take an olive drab and instead of putting a dark green under it, or a darker olive drab like Hilo Drab or something, what if we put blue under it? What if we put whole red under it? How does that shift things? Does it shift things, or is this really ultimately more of a contrast battle and the tonality doesn't matter as much? So to drag out this silly card again, think of this as essentially an x-axis of brightness. So we can have everything from a Hilo Drab over here to an olive drab to like a faded olive drab towards this end, and that's a spectrum of olive drab. What happens when we add a y-axis? That's essentially the rainbow. So you know, red, orange, etc., all the way up to indigo and violet at the top. If we put those underneath, does that shift the angle lines in any way, shape, or form? How does that affect this whole idea of contrast variation and contrast blending through opacity? Does it affect it at all? Does it not? You know, I think we've seen in the green and the gray, particularly with the green, that it does slightly. I mean, it's, you know, again, going back to the baseball analogy of you're throwing a pitch, it's going home, but you can still tweak it a little bit. You can still throw a curveball or a fastball or a slider. Does essentially adding colors into that mix, darker colors, but colors that are substantially shifted tonally from the blend coat, does that just basically give you a wider range of pitches? Or does it allow you to, you know, instead of throwing a curveball, maybe you can throw to a second catcher who's over 5 degrees shifted from the main catcher? That's what we're going to find out. So for this experiment, I put a lot of thought into it because there are ultimately tons of different variations, and we only have one upper surface left to play with. So I've settled on using 2 main contenders for our blend coats, and those are going to be olive drab, because, you know, it's a green and it's probably the most common green shot at pretty much any model, you know, or olive drab or versions of things like it. I would say that, you know, RAF dark green, depending on the blend you get, isn't too far off from this. There are various German shades that are close-ish to this. It's just, it's a good common shade of greenish stuff. And on the other side, we'll be using RAF Dark Earth, which is a nice brown that's not super dark, not super light. It's sort of in that gray area. Come on. You know, you can see it's got kind of a muddy-ish quality to it. And I figure like these two are about the same in terms of overall where they would fall on that black to white spectrum, but green and brown. Now, underneath them, we're going to be putting a couple of different things. So, some Swedish dark green, which we've been playing with before. Some, where did it go here? Some chocolate, which we're going to mix with black to darken it up a bit. I feel like this is too light, but, you know, add a little bit of black into it and it becomes like this really nice deep brown. Whole red, which works so well with glossy blue. I don't know how it'll play with these colors. US Insignia Blue, or as guns like to call it, USAF Thunderbirds Blue. This is the color used on Stars and Bars and things like that. And Eggplant Dark Gray. So each of these are generally pretty different from the blend coats that are going to be going down on top. The ones that are similar-ish. The dark green is pretty similar to the olive drab. I mean, comparatively. And the dark earth and the chocolate are probably equally in that spectrum. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap these, and we're going to be putting dark green under dark earth and dark chocolate under olive drab. So essentially that's what we're going to do. I'm going to set up a control mechanism where if you look at the aircraft overall, and say we take a line and just cut it across the wings, the leading edge of the wings I am going to do in traditional black basing 101. So it will be the olive drab and the dark earth marbled and blended, so we can have that control group to see what that looks like. And it'll probably be more like the leading third, so that, you know, we have it there but it's not taking up too much space. And then on the back portion of the wing, I'm going to be working in all these different colors. As one fun extra thing, on the forward portion of the fuselage, so say the cockpit area forward, I'm going to be working in all of these tones and marbling them all together into this kind of mishmash soup of multicolored rainbow marbling. And we're going to see what that does with these colors. You know, again, olive drab on one side, dark earth on the other, even to here, so they'll be kind of splitting the difference on the fuselage. So this one's going to be a lot of fun to see what the hell happens, because honestly, I have no expectations of whether any of these are going to work. I have a few suspicions of ones that will work better than others. You know, I think the dark blue under the olive drab will work better than it will under the dark earth, for example. But we'll see. So let's get to it and have some fun. Okay, so we're going to start off with Guns C29 Hull Red. And I'm going to be applying this to the outer wing. Okay, so now it's time to move a step inboard and do Guns C326 Blue. Again, this is the insignia blue used on US round or US stars and bars and things like that. So here we've got dark blue, whole red, doing their little thing. So I've got a slight change of plans in place. I was going to originally do, 1, 2, 3, 4 colors on the on each wing, but since we've got 5 we're working with, I'm going to go ahead and do all 5 across both wings. So we're going to put the chocolate and the dark green on each wing as well and see how they interplay with the olive drab and the dark earth. So here we've got dark green going down now. Okay, so we've added the Swedish dark green right here. Now it's time to move on to chocolate. And I've decided to not darken this. We're going to play with it as is and see how it does. Okay, so before we bring in the olive drab and the dark earth, here are the 5 colors that we're trying as sort of undercoats to those coats. So we've got whole red, insignia blue, eggplant blue, gray, whatever, Swedish dark green, and chocolate. And then in the fuselage area here, we have done a sort of rainbow marble of all of them. And I'm curious to see how that ends up playing in the cheap seats. So I'm going to clean up the airbrush, and then we're going to fire up the dark earth and olive drab and see what happens. Okay, so it's moment of truth time, and we're going to be putting olive drab down over the port wing and the port fuselage. Okay, so we've got a good marble coat going on in here with the olive drab. We've got the colors up here. So it's time to go ahead and start moving into blending mode. Okay, so the olive drab is wrapped up, and we're going to move on to the starboard side now, which is going to get treated to some dark earth. Okay, so we've marbled on the dark earth. Now it's time to go and do the blend coat. Okay, so now that we've blended in the olive drab and the dark earth, here's where we've netted out. Now, the whole point of this experiment was to see what would happen if we marbled in distinctly different tones, you know, whole red, insignia blue, things that are vastly different from a color profile perspective from the colors going down on top. And seeing if that tonal value would shift anywhere near the degree that the light and dark value does. And honestly, not really. I honestly feel like the dark earth was a mistake. The gun's interpretation of this is much more olive than I would maybe feel comfortable with, just looking at, you know, various Spitfires and things like that that wore it. This definitely seems a greener tone than I would expect. So if we just focus on the olive drab, because I think it tells the better story, I mean, you can see some variation shifts happening here, but they're very, very subtle. So just to kind of go through the tail of the tape here, we've got the whole red, the insignia blue, the eggplant blue, the Swedish dark green, and the chocolate. Now, of these, the chocolate, I think, made the biggest impression. It shifted things distinctly towards the brown end. And if I were doing, you know, an olive drab, you know, a B17 or a P47, something like that, I would certainly consider working this in places into the marble coat just to shift the tones slightly. The Swedish dark green, again, created a slightly bluer, greener shift, but only slightly. You know, you have to really look for it to see it. The blues made a bit more of a difference, but I think all they really seem to do is just kind of darken it a bit. I mean, they don't seem to have really shifted the tone. You know, maybe it seems a bit more desaturated, if nothing else. Maybe kind of the opposite of what happened with the glossy blue. You know, if you look at it compared to the olive drab right up here, this seems a bit more muted. And then the whole red honestly turned it a bit more gray. It didn't darken it really like the blues did, but it definitely did some slight shift. You know, I mean, trying to get a good angle here so you can see it in the camera. So ultimately things happened, but as I've been saying with the blend coat, you're only going to be able to shift it so much with what you put underneath it. So I guess not only in terms of contrast, but in terms of tonality as well. So with that, let's turn the camera around and yap at it for a while. So this last experiment really built upon several of the learnings that we've pulled together from all the various Black Basing 201 demos to date. You know, the guideline of going from dark to light has held up throughout. But that has all been about the contrast gap. So, you know, you start here, your paint's here, you want to sneak up on it, essentially. As I likened it to the idea of parking a car. And so when you pull into the space, you want to get up as close as possible to the bumper of the car opposite you without hitting it. It's pretty easy to do if the car is stationary and you have this one variable that you're controlling, which is your car moving. You know, that's why using the light and the dark and trying to hit both ends at the same time really narrows down the gap that you can play with, because you have to get to a certain color opacity with your blend coat, and if you're trying to cover both ends against the middle, it really shrinks down that range you can play with. Because, you know, let's say you've got olive drab, let's call it a 50, okay? And your blend coat or your marble coat takes you from 0 up to a range of 50 to about 35% opacity, or 35% of olive drab. Then over here you go with something lighter that's like a 65. Well, as you build in this, you know, this darker side, it's going to get gradually lighter, whereas this stuff is automatically going to be lighter, and you're going to have to put on more coverage to make it just to a 50. And by that point, you're already blowing out a lot of the stuff here in this 35 to 50 range. So you end up with essentially a monochromatic finish, or very close to that. So that's where we've been so far, and that whole dark to light idea has held up. But it only really focuses on this one axis. So what if we add a second, what if we take, you know, this is an x-axis and add a y-axis of color? Does that change anything? I've been hesitant to go one way or the other because, you know, sometimes you never know with this sort of stuff. But I think now having gone through it, especially with the olive drab side of things, I would say kind of slightly, but not really. So, you know, we do have a bunch of different color tones up here on this sort of back 2/3 of the wing. And you can see slight differences going on here. I would say the most pronounced is with the chocolate under the olive drab. Definitely browned it out a bit. And, you know, you can see the blues here, so the insignia blue and the eggplant dark blue-gray, whatever you want to call it. They did take it to a darker place and maybe a bit greener. The Swedish dark green definitely took it greener, but, you know, you have to really look for it. And the whole red took it, you know, it faded it out a bit, gave it a bit of maybe a grayer washed out tone. But, you know, compared to what's going on, fucking moth, compared to what's going on in the olive drab up front, I mean, it's a slight difference. It's a matter of degrees. And so it all comes back to the, I love making analogies, I guess. It all comes back to the idea of the blend coat is like throwing a pitch. You know, whatever you do to it, it's still going to home plate. It's still going to look like olive drab at the end of the day. And so you can put some spin on it. You can, you know, if you put chocolate under it, you make it a little slight bit browner. If you put dark blue under it, you make it a little slight bit bluer. Which is great if that's, you know, if that's exactly what you're going for. But if you're expecting it to massively shift what this looks like, it's not going to happen. So the question becomes then, where do we go from here? You know, if you've baked in a little bit of this sort of tonal variation, and you can see, let's see if we can get a good view of it here. You know, there's some here on the light is making this really tough to do. You know, on the cowl where it's all mixed together, it provides some interesting stuff, kind of, but I mean, again, nothing significantly over and above what you get out of just black basing the olive drab. So, you know, if you want to curve the shot, as we've been saying, you know, if you want to throw a curveball into this instead of just throwing it straight down the middle, by all means, add these color tones into the mix, and you will get some very subtle shifts going on. In addition to the sort of contrast and opacity variation, you'll have that slight bit of color variation as well. But if you really want to amp it up and do more than that, that's where, you know, you need to start thinking about maybe varying up the blend coat or planning ahead to layer in different colors during the weathering process, which is where you can really bring a lot of this stuff out and really do those subtle shifts that you want that really affect the color of the paint. So yeah, ultimately, this one is, you know, I don't want to call it a bust because, you know, we're all about getting that very subtle shift happening in here that stops these paints from looking just like a single color of something sprayed on plastic. You know, whatever we can do to change that up, especially with a more weathered airframe or a more weathered, you know, armor vehicle, whatnot, the more visual interest it's going to have, and the better it's going to reflect the way that these things tended to actually wear in the field. And so, shut up, compressor. And so thinking about this, you know, as I've mentioned a couple times now in various videos, as the first step can get you pretty far. You know, you can set up this variation and then really build on it with washes and filters. And, you know, if you want to add pigments and things like that, that's, you know, another option. I have found that as I work through these, doing that doesn't obscure what we've got going on here. In fact, it complements it and it adds depth to it. So, yeah, I mean, I guess the final takeaway from this is, you know, understanding that principally what you're getting out of the black basing process, kind of whichever way you choose to attack it from, is this whole thing, is the idea of shifting in a micro, very localized fashion, the opacity and contrast of the surface, and using that to really get some interesting depth built into it. The tonal shifts that you can get from a color perspective are slight, but that slightness also has its own potential benefit. You know, again, if you were to imagine taking what we've got going on here on this wing and sort of building it in a more randomized fashion across the airframe, where some parts have more of this sort of orange, brownish olive drab, and other parts are this darker, greener, you know, slightly blue shifted type thing, you can do a lot of really subtle, interesting stuff there before you ever start in on the weathering. So, yeah, that's that. And with that, I'm going to call this Black Basing 201 adventure a wrap. And I will probably be coming back at some point in the future and playing around with what weathering looks like on top of all of this stuff. So, I mean, I've got 4 Hellcats now covered in varying degrees and things of paint. And as I've been saying over and over and over again, this is just the first step. And so taking it from here to building in other effects and other phenomenon is another whole aspect of modeling that, you know, doesn't, in my opinion, get touched as often as it should. So I've got other stuff that I want to get to, other projects, things like that, but I am planning at some point in the future to come back around to these and have a go at them and walk through some of my processes for taking these and really adding more to them with what goes down on the surface. But I want to make perfectly clear, it's not a cookbook. It's not, you know, add this, add that, add this, and you're done. Ideally, every different model is going to have its own different mix of things that go into it to make it work and make it come to life. And it's not so much understanding a formula and just kind of checking off the boxes. It's more understanding the mechanics of each individual piece and what they do and what they tweak, and understanding what those levers are that you can pull on from a weathering perspective to really bring it all together, and then knowing which ones to pull in and apply for a given project. So anyway, that's that. This has been an absolute blast. If it has been a bit of a tedious nightmare at the same time to edit and throw all these videos up online. So I thank you all very much for sticking with me through this and watching them, because it would suck if I just went through all the editing time and nobody watched them. And with that, I am going to sign off and get back to actually building some shit. So thanks for watching, and see y'all later.